I'm Patricia Bruckmann. I came to the University of Toronto in the fall of 1953 to be a graduate student in English, and until that point I knew absolutely nothing about Marshall McLuhan at all. Nothing. I discovered him when I went to inquire about courses, and the secretary of the department, who was himself an academic in the 17th century, thought that I might find this interesting. Do you want to hear the story of my first meeting? So I was told that I would find him. There was then a house where the McLuhans lived on the grounds of the St. Mike's campus. So I went over, and it was the sort of house you couldn't figure out which was the front door and which was the back. So I circled the house several times, and I thought, God, they'll think I'm a burglar. So finally I made a choice, and it was the wrong one. And I opened the door and ended up in a kind of dark corridor, and I put my foot into a bag of oranges. The bag broke, and many, there must have been at least 3 dozen oranges, were all over the place. And when the door opened by Corinne McLuhan, she saw a graduate student in the dark who was desperately trying to stuff dozens of oranges back into a broken brown bag. I said, I'm terribly sorry. I seem to have got my... She said, don't worry at all. In the southern accent you will have known very nicely. And I said, I've actually come to see Professor McLuhan. It's hard to be serious when you're kneeling amidst the oranges. So she said, Marshall's just shaving and he'll be right outside. So she led me to what in fact was the front door through the house. And I sat down on something we call in New England a glider, but one of those. I sat down on it and it collapsed, at which point he came out and helped me put it together. He thought this was very, very funny. This was a good omen, he said, that it all fell apart. And we sat on the reconstructed glider and we talked for 2 hours. We talked about, he was passionately interested in how the world was governed now by the cult of the East and the cult of the West, and I thought I'd never met anybody as interesting as this. We talked about Masons and Rosicrucians and literature and what did I want to do. And it was perfectly clear that while I wanted to do other courses, I had come from a very small convent school in the States, and I'd never met anyone like this. So I thought, this is the course I've got to do. When we were almost winding down, and the couch was still on, there wandered across the field, and this is someone you really should get in the film. Have you heard of Donald Thiel? All right. Well, it may be difficult for all the reasons you'll know. Suddenly this rather portly young man appeared, and one of his problems is he can't open his mouth any more than that. So he mumbles, and he said, this is Don Thiel, mumble, mumble. He was wearing a Timothy Dwight Yale blazer. I don't know why I remember that, but he was. And he was obviously the prize student, as indeed he remained for a long time. I signed up for the course. We went, as you always do, in the graduate school once a week for a 2-hour seminar. It met in his office, which was for some reason a long, thin office. And he had a lot of books in old orange crates, especially a huge collection of detective stories that he kept on the top. And the orange crates, of course, would have fallen down, but he had his Cambridge rowing oar in between, and that kept it apart. Now, you didn't really have to duck when you went in, but I found myself always doing this. Whenever I went home for a holiday, he'd say, you need some detective stories to keep you going. And he would hand it to me and say, put it inside a volume of the Interpreter's Bible, and nobody will know what you're doing. Ha, ha, ha. He read detective stories voraciously. Maybe that, I think, is... Do you know the wonderful essay called Footprints in the Sands of Crime? Super essay on the detective story. And there were about 8 or 9 of us. Don Thiel always sat in. I don't remember who the others were, but we became, I'm afraid, a kind of evil inner circle that we thought we, knew more than the others and were more clued into the things Marshall was saying. He read poetry wonderfully, and by that I mean not just read it out loud, but when he dropped the cult of the East and the cult of the West, he was a brilliant explicator of Eliot and Pound. That's what we were doing that year. And somehow in the course of that year, I also became the occasional babysitter for the McLuhans. He always left you, when you babysat, a bottle of white wine and a rope of figs. And what I remember very vividly one night was they were going somewhere, and Eric McLuhan came early. He was then about, 14 or 15, and he sort of looked me up and down and said, well, who are you? And I said, the babysitter. Isn't it past your bedtime? I don't know that we've ever gotten on since then. But it was a wonderful year, and it made me think about poetry in a whole lot of different ways, and about literature. And I think some of the students got very much stuck in the routine of finding out what the cult was or what the major thing. But if you stayed clear of that, which I think anybody any good would, you learned a tremendous amount. And he cared about you very much, as the case of the famous figs and white wine. He always wanted to know if you'd had a good time. The best night was the night he called in a desperation and said he'd forgotten that this was the next year, I guess. The graduate seminar was meeting, and he'd forgotten, and he had to go to the choir school where Eric must have been singing. So he said, could you go down and deal with the class until I get back? So I was going off with somebody, a guy from the CBC, and I said, we've got to go down and help out. And I walked in, there they all sat, waiting for the guru to turn up. And I said, Professor McLuhan is unable to come tonight until about 10 o'clock, but he's asked me to get you going. I was making it up as I went along. And now I walked over to the record cabinet, and I pulled out Dame Edith Sitwell reading Facade at full volume. I put it on the record player, turned it up about as high as it would go, and I said, now please listen to this with very great care, and when you've finished, turn it over and play the other side, and just keep doing it. And the guy from the CBC said, are you crazy? And I said, let's keep them going. The next day, Marshall called up, and he said, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. That's exactly what to do. They were filled with all kinds of crazy things when I got back. But his sense was that this, again, was an idea. He said, why did you do it? I said, I was desperate, Marshall, that's all. That's okay. One of the nice things he did when my husband and I were married, as a wedding present, he gave us a copy of The Mechanical Bride. This was the kind of sense of humor he did have. He wrote lots of letters for me. If I asked him towards the end, he would complain and complain about them, and then he would race down to Don Thiel's house. Don lived at the end of St. Mary Street, and say, quick, quick, we've got to write Pat a real humdinger of a letter, even if she has asked late. He read Finnegan's Wake out loud with us, drinking gin out of a plastic cup, and, making commentaries as it went along. What I'm trying to say is that you didn't just take his course, you became part of the circle. And if you did become part of the circle, there was absolutely nothing Marshall wouldn't do for you. I don't think it wasn't that he played favorites. He could just see, interesting people when they came along. He was aware of the fact that he wasn't approved of by lots of members of the university, but he enjoyed it. He loved being, the sense of the outsider. And if people had suddenly started to say to him, well, what you're saying is right, he would have been absolutely appalled.
There's a lot of different things to talk about. I wonder if you could start by talking a little bit about his Catholicism.
Because it's a deeply important part of Marshall. Not a complicated piety, a very simple piety. Someone who went to Mass almost every single day, never talked about religion. The result was he was inclined, I think, partly because he was a simple piety. That, I think, is at the root of some of the simplicities of the ideas. When I was a graduate student, everything was the cult of the East or the cult of the West. And some of us would go horizontal for this, and some would go vertical for this. And Marshall did have a certain, a kind of reductionist tendency sometimes, but I don't mean that as a disparaging comment. I mean, he would work things to a center, but then he would abandon that and go on to another set of ideas. He was all hooked up with the notion of the Freemasons were running everything. And in fact, when I wrote an MA dissertation, I wrote it for somebody in the 18th century, but I got absolutely fascinated by Rosicrucians and Masons and all kinds of things like that. So you always found out interesting things. And then you had, if you were going to preserve a certain kind of intellectual freedom, to move outside the circle. Because Marshall did like to have, as sometimes very gifted people do, a circle of people around him, and I wasn't especially wanting to do that. But the other Catholic stuff, he became a convert, of course, a long, long time ago. Fred might be able to speak to you about that, and Fred would probably not feel in the same way that I do. He'd commend the simplicity, and I do in a way. But Marshall was not. He was not what I would call an intellectual Catholic. Not at all. No. It was a matter of he had a simple faith. Remember his interest in Chesterton, What did Chesterton say? I think I was going to put this in an essay on Marshall at one point. A matter of accepting, with a Chestertonian kind of simplicity, that the church was right, and that was a faith, and you made an assent to that. But Marshall would never have dreamed of arguing elaborate points of theology. Indeed, I wonder if that's something that you shouldn't check with other people like Ted Carpenter and Logan and so forth, that one of his gifts was reaching and seeing something simple. So in other words, that can be an advantage as well as a disadvantage if you're going to have a very elaborate kind of discussion about it.
Of course, you identify McLuhan as a professor of literature because that's what he taught you, and yet we don't really think of him anymore as a literary professor, do we?
We don't, and that is a shame, because what he taught us, really, was to read carefully and to read out loud and to listen to what was going on. It sounds, I know, as if he's a crazy theoretician who moved away, but he didn't. Do you know about his own doctoral thesis? Because I think that's utterly central.
I'd love to hear you talk.
Well, what happened was that I wanted to look at it because I was asked, two people, one of them, Fred Flahive, was going to do an essay, a book of essays on McLuhan by the non-crazies. So we sat trying to think who the non-crazies were. In other words, people who weren't groupies, which we weren't. We were just people who admired a very interesting, gifted man who had eccentric and wonderful ideas. So we got to the end of it, and they said there's one more essay we need, and we need McLuhan's influence on 18th century studies, and that is your pigeon. Now, 18th century studies really didn't come alive in North America until, I would say, the 40s, 50s, things like that. And one of the people who is most influential, and that's why I wish this volume hadn't crashed, I got the paper done, because it established very nicely how important Marshall had been in the particular track that 18th century studies took. The example is in a person, I don't know, is he still alive, Aubrey Williams? Has he come into your... He wrote a wonderful book called On Pope's Dunciad, and you find extraordinary quotations of McLuhan there. I tracked down, Aubrey Williams was at Yale, so I thought that's the way to go at it. Discovered that Marshall's own thesis, which did all kinds of exciting stuff on the rhetorical patterns of the 18th century, had gone to Williams, but from Williams it went on to Cleanth Brooks, thought to be the father of 18th century studies at Yale, and it was read all over the place, because Marshall was incredibly generous. He would give you anything. Corinne would tell you that there are some lost pound letters because he lent them to people who didn't return them. So I started to work on that, and it became clear that this man, and the thesis is written in a very different style, not the little pithy things. It's written in a kind of lovely, elaborate Ciceronian style, not at all the little squibs and the witty stuff that you associate with Marshall. And this was being done when? In 1942 or 3. Corinne typed the whole thing, so it's filled with typographical mistakes, and it has a cigarette hole on the front, which nobody bothered to fix. The more I read it, the more I became persuaded that it should be published, because it would say that Marshall was an absolutely fabulous scholar. What it was on, he was essentially a Renaissance person, and he decided to work on the rhetoric of Thomas Nash, a person that nobody's ever heard of now, except Nash scholars. Then he started to study how these rhetorical patterns were really important to see in people after Nash, especially in the 18th century. And this kind of thing was then taken up and used as a way of approaching 18th century literature much later. But the person who is at the center of it is, in fact, not the phrase maker, but the very, very good scholar McLuhan. Now, it was that kind of precise attention to text that he was terrific at, and he taught me to read things in ways that other people had not done.
Let's talk a little bit about his thesis. Can you first explain the trivium, which I gather is at the heart of it?
All right, okay. Easy to do. Medieval, it's a cornerstone of medieval education. What you did, if you studied the trivium, which just means 3, you studied grammar, rhetoric, and logic. What grammar did was to take apart, say, a sentence, the way you probably still do as a student if they were teaching grammar anymore, to see how a sentence is put together. And then when you moved on to rhetoric, and there were stages in medieval education like this, you moved on to how do you put this beautifully together, persuasively, because that's what rhetoric does. And then when you'd finally dealt with that, you moved on to logic, and logic was a sense of how was it meaningful? How did it contribute to knowledge? The nicest example I can think of is used in Chaucer that every undergraduate gets to know, which is that there was a clerk of Oxenford on the Canterbury pilgrimage, and he had gone unto logic long ago. And what that means is that he's older than you think he is because he'd had to work his way through grammar, rhetoric, and logic too. And the trivium, I always forget exactly what they are, but it's music and mathematics and things of that. But the cornerstone of medieval education was mastering the arts of speech, which were the trivium. Now that locates for Marshall his tremendous sense of the importance of speech in poetry, in literature. Joyce said, some of my puns are trivial and some are quadrivial. Now, he meant not some of my puns seem to be silly, the way we talk about something's trivial, but he meant some of them are rooted in speech, and then he's punning again. Some of them have to do with music, astronomy, mathematics, and so forth. So the first thing Marshall did was he realized that if he wanted to talk about the rhetoric of Nash, he had to go back and find out everything from the beginning. So the thesis goes back. My husband was a medievalist. He said that it was a brilliant chapter on the Middle Ages. A study of, how did this work? How was it part of the system? How was it taught? Since obviously it wasn't in English, it was being taught in Latin. And once you got that settled out, you moved on to how did this program for education train the mind? I think it's not a surprise that Marshall spent some time with the Jesuits in the States, because the system of the trivium and quadrivium is still to a certain extent used in classically run Jesuit schools as part of what they call the ratio, how they do their education. The first thing you do, because my brother still did it in a Jesuit school, was to become educated in how you managed speech. I think you can see this is another simple idea, but it's very, very complicated at the same time. So what Marshall does is to go ahead and study the beginning, all through the Middle Ages, all through controversies in which some sense was we should have a revolution and not use this system, the problems of that, on to Nash, on to the 18th century. So it's a thesis which starts right at the very beginning. That's why he was always so interested in the Medieval Institute, because the Medieval Institute was the place where they were still studying the origins of the thing that concerned him.
And how did he work his way through that material?
I'm not sure that I know. I can only go by the evidence in terms of he seemed to have that sense. You read one text. I think we all do or should do it that way. You read one text, and that gives you a set of questions. Where did this come from and what did it mean? And you have to keep going back and back and back, and you end up looking at two things, really. And this is perhaps where some theology or philosophy gets into it. You go back to, through the scholastic philosophers and rhetorics, you begin to say to yourself, what does the choice of a certain rhetoric mean? Is it what we would say now, an innocent decision to use one kind of rhetoric more than another? Do you know the distinction that got drawn later on that Marshall, I think, would have sympathized with? The distinction between the so-called Ciceronian school and the Senecan school? I can give you a really appallingly oversimplified version of that simply by saying that what you do in the Senecan style is also called the curt style. In other words, it's a very witty, chopped kind of style. Cut it all down. The Ciceronian style has much more of a grandeur. You try to write a piece of oratory, persuade an audience. The audience is possibly more passive during this. But his interest was in the Senecan style and how the Senecan style moves to, as a kind of, they exist not in tension with each other. The Senecan style sort of criticizes the other. Now, the funny thing about Marshall is that it seems to me he ended his life in a kind of version of this curt or witty Senecan style, in which sometimes you just didn't see the connected spaces between these two things. What you do is you read the early McLuhan as you would read, say, a well-written scholarly book. It has premises at the beginning, it sets them down, it gets to a certain place, it occasionally has footnotes which start to conduct another kind of argument. And that this is I'm trying to find a way of putting it which doesn't sound pompous.
That's okay, you can sound pompous.
That it's this kind of rhetoric in poetry, in novels, for example, in Joyce, in Pope, and in Swift, is a classical style. It relies on a sense of the command of all the figures of rhetoric. So that the more of these figures of rhetoric you command, you are learned. You're also kind of fun to listen to. You can carry this to a crazy dimension in which you begin to pogo stick from figure to figure. But what Marshall is fascinated by in his study of Nash and the others is how they use this style to control certain kinds of experience. And so his sense would be that the foundation of education should be the trivium. And I mean, I must confess, I think so too.
And what do you think his sense was of the life of the trivium through succeeding generations of literature? What became in the end of the trivium?
I think his sense was that the trivium was under attack. Now, this is when I'm invoking Marshall, who could always see the enemy creeping up from the sides. That kind of, as it were, civilized control of speech was being menaced sometimes by people who didn't look like menaces. Joseph Addison, the guy who did the Spectator papers, have Addison and Steele. The popularization of literature, which means that you adjust your rhetoric, obviously, as any of us know, to the audience you're speaking to. But it becomes more and more diluted. And I think that was the thing that concerned him a great deal. That's what he's talking about in The Mechanical Bride.
In what sense?
Well, you reduce grief to I cried till they told me it was watertight about the coffin. And he calls it, the mechanical bride, so that something which is should be natural is no longer natural. It's being created by the new language of industry. So the tyranny of advertising. Marshall was fascinated by advertising, but advertising as a way of controlling us, so that you're no longer in charge. You're being managed by other kinds of really rather debased speech. You find it in the schools now. I think he was right. Nobody gets taught how grammar works, and they certainly don't get taught anything about rhetoric. And there's a really sad lack in that. So I think he was, as he would have said, on to something. He was always being on to something. We have to find this out, he would say. We've got to look up these things. But one of the other things that I did like about this is that he did have a very passionate moral sense of what he was doing and what he thought other people in education should be doing too. That we had a responsibility. And he identified with authors like satirists who did think they had a responsibility. There's a wonderful essay that you should read if you haven't, called The New York Wits. It's really an attack on the readers of The New Yorker, and it has, or on the shape of the cheap wit of The New Yorker. He says at the end, thus do the courtiers of dullness and unreason ape-like assume the regal function of wit. I thought, that's great. But I guess he was also important to me because he did feel this way. He gave me, as I saw many years later on, a sense of what a vocation might be in terms of what I was doing. So that anything that diminished its being not only fun to read, but hard to read, and it should be hard to read, so that it should be, and it should also be a communal adventure. That's why he loved these gin drinking sessions over Finnegan's Wake, because you have to have a whole lot of people reading Finnegan's Wake to have it make sense, and you have to read it out loud, and you have to read it to yourself. And his sense was this is the way in which you got the whole human psyche together, by having this, what you saw to yourself, what you shared with others, and you had a kind of, ideally, a communal adventure.
What do you think he got out of the modern writers like Joyce and Eliot and so on?
I think he got, in a sense, a confirmation that he was right about his interest in rhetoric and in that kind of an analysis of literature, because these were people who are very much, if you like, practitioners of, to make it again, simple-minded, the Senecan style. You don't read The Wasteland out like a detective story. You have to read it out in fragments, and then you start putting these fragments together. The same thing for Pound, the same thing for Joyce. Anyone whom Marshall was attracted to. The 18th century satirists were not people who make things easy for you. And his sense was that literature didn't make it easy for you, that that was the fun of it, that it wasn't a detective story that you solved, but it was something to which you had to give a great deal of attention and to listen to how it worked on you, and that had not just an emotional effect, but a moral effect. And I was quite persuaded by that. It seems to me that's right. And that was his attraction to writers like Eliot, who were going to, or as Pound says, to make it new. In a sense, that's the beginning of every poetic revolution. Everybody thinks he's going to make it new. But that sense of Pound doing that, and Pound writing the cantos in fragments, Eliot and Pound working on Eliot to do it in a different way. I think, in a sense, he gave me my own sense of the fragment, and my sense of the fragment became the basis of a book I wrote a few years ago on the Scribblers Club, which was the 18th century. And the sense that to do things in fragments is kind of fun. Because that was the other thing, that Marshall was much committed to the notion of fun. He loved jokes. He was fun to be around, and the jokes were always based on some kind of verbal play, verbal pun, the way The Mechanical Bride is. And that was, in a sense, what kept you in control. Remember the beginning of The Mechanical Bride, when he says that about Poe's sailor, when Poe's sailor was going down in the maelstrom, he realized that if he could find out how the maelstrom worked, he would get out. And so he worked out how it worked, and he came up through the maelstrom. I think that is the cornerstone of Marshall's fascination with modern arts of communication. You had to figure out how these things were working. Now, whether he did that in his later life, I don't know, because I'm not very good on his later stuff. I'm much more able to speak specifically about my own experience of him, say, as a teacher.
What about Finnegan's Wake? Why is that so important to him?
It constantly comes up because in a way it represents, I suppose, the natural home of everything I've been talking about. An ability you can't skip in the wake. You've got to pay attention all the time. And you have to pay attention all the time. You have to be thinking, and ideally to have somebody with you who's also thinking about it. I think that's it. That it was the work that absolutely demanded a total engagement, and in that way it was central to his notion of what literature should be doing.
And he seemed to think that Joyce had already dealt with the ideas of communication that Marshall McLuhan himself was probing. Yes,
and he said that the only thing he was doing, in a way, was showing you, I guess, how the Joycean maelstrom worked. Joyce had been there, and Joyce had seen it all. Joyce had seen the shape of modern communication, and had seen the mess that things were going to be happening, and the only way in which Finnegan would wake again would be if you understood, as it were, the maelstrom, and that's what would get you out. But that takes an enormous amount of time. I think he felt that Ulysses did it too, because what Ulysses would be doing was taking a very old rhetorical structure like the epic and reprogramming it onto the city of Dublin and seeing what you could do. He was serious, but I don't think the one thing that I think I'd love to see you get in some way. The last time I saw Marshall was 3 weeks before he died. And we'd been invited to dinner at my former supervisor's house. My former supervisor was a student of the 18th century. And that evening, Marshall couldn't, because of the strokes, couldn't speak. I sat between Marshall and Corinne. And what I was very taken by was that somehow I could still have a conversation with Marshall, even though he couldn't speak. And every so often, there would be something I really just didn't say, and I would turn to Corinne, and all those many years of marriage kicked in. And so there was a sense of communication between the two of them in terms of gesture, because that was the other thing he was intrigued by, was the language of gesture, that you couldn't just talk. You talked with your body, and that's why the Finnegan is important. Remember, the sleeping giant of Finnegan is rising again. So his sense was that you used your body as well as your words and your mind. But that night was simply remarkable, and I realized that when I left, I'd arrived thinking this is going to be very hard. But it wasn't. It was a wonderful evening in which I had a conversation with Marshall. And 3 weeks later, he died. And when I walked into the funeral home, threw my arms around Corinne, she said, that was such a wonderful evening, 3 weeks ago, in which we had spoken in silence. And maybe that's the central thing about Marshall, too, that he was listening to.
Can you explain about the sleeping giant?
Well, the notion is, I think I'm the worst person to talk about Finnegan because I'm not a good reader of Joyce, and I'm not even terribly fond of Finnegan's Wake. But what you get is you start with if you like, an Irish myth of the giant Finn McCool, who is now. You're trying to wake him again, and how do you wake the dead? Well, from my Irish family, I know what you do. You have a wake, and what do you have at a wake? You have lots of whiskey, and you sort of pour this on, and then eventually you get this sort of wonderful, almost bardic communication between people who are drunk and at a wake. It's all the night that Paddy Murphy died, and then there's a kind of rising up of this. What I associate with the wake, in terms of my own Irish backdrop, is that things get wilder and wilder and funnier at Irish wakes, and that in a way you have waked the corpse, because the corpse has been an occasion of a communal scene. Okay, I think that's what Finnegan's Wake does. It puts you together in a kind of communal scene. And people talk. They make allusions to literature all over Hell's Half Acre. And it all begins to come together. And then it goes circularly, as you know, along the river and by Eve's End of Bow Bend, and then it goes back again. But I think the idea is to wake the giant, not just to wake Irish sensibility as if it were, part of the whole Irish romantic revolution and the revivification of a whole host of things, but rather of civilization itself. You start with, instead of dealing with Dublin, you go back from Dublin, go back to the sleeping giant of the Irish, and move up from that. I've always found it a very resistant text. I mean, I could read it as we used to do with Marshall out loud, or I guess with somebody I was semi-engaged to at one stage, and read that out loud. But you really need a group of people who are in a certain kind of mood, because what they are doing is replicating civilization, I guess, at that point. You can't do things alone. Solitary reading doesn't work. And I guess it's one of the reasons why I'm interested in groups like the Scribblers Lot and Bloomsbury and so forth, who do represent group learning, which is, of course, never complete. That was Marshall's other sense. Things were never complete. But that was wonderful, because you always had something to think about and to do.
And did Marshall encourage that sort of group learning?
Now, my own experience of it was that he very much encouraged it by asking you, what did you think of that? And so you would have had to go out and think of something. And from there, we just went on, one person after another. There were some tiresome people who really wanted to come and take notes because it was a course, but that was never the way Marshall ran it. I mean, if you had come to pass an examination for modern literature, this was not the person from whom to do it, unless you did it, unless you took energy from this and went back and did a lot of reading. And that's what seemed to me was so important about him as a teacher. There were complaints about him as a teacher, because he used to give everybody A's, which drove the department crazy, because he just didn't want to discuss this.
How did the bulk of students respond to his method?
Some didn't like it, and I think they faded away quite early, because Marshall wasn't the sort of person who, as it were, gave you good notes to write down. He was somebody who really did, and the fashionable phrase, turn you on. And you went and read everything he suggested. And then sometimes it didn't matter. I mean, it was just a private interest of his. But that was okay. It doesn't make any difference. And I loved going out to have coffee with Marshall because he wasn't the sort of person who drew lines. I remember sitting at a coffee shop with him on Bay Street as he tried to persuade me to do something. Dear God, I've now forgotten what he was convinced this would be, the MA thesis, to end all MA theses. And I said, not for me, Marshall. You just don't care. You just want to go into the Renaissance. You don't want to do any of these things. And you could have little quarrels with him, too. And finally, when I did all this stuff on Pope, he thought that was a good idea.
Now, how well known was McLuhan at this point?
Oh, I think at that stage, no, not that many people knew about him. No. I think he became famous later on. Because after all, if you think, John and I were married when in 1958. That's when we had The Mechanical Bride. And, it was a nice local joke that Marshall had given it to us. But while later on someone said, what would you accept for that book? And I said, which Marshall had written, I said absolutely nothing, But he wasn't famous then, no. He became famous later on when he started to hit the airwaves and get into Woody Allen films and things like that.
And what was the University of Toronto like at this point?
Well, it was a very conventional university. To a certain extent, it still is. What we have is a wonderful English department. That's the reason I came from the States on a scholarship to come here. But it was very historically based. Marshall was very historically based, but people tended not to see that. And I thought they thought he was really rather wacky. He came from... he was a variety of things that I think, in a sense, Protestant Southern Ontario couldn't entirely understand. He was a Catholic convert. He had extraordinary ideas. And, of course, I don't know if you're interviewing somebody who will be able to be helpful about the influence of Harold Innes on him and Harold Innes on communication and so forth. But he was interested in other disciplines. Now, that kind of thing has become terribly fashionable now, but it wasn't fashionable then.
And what was Toronto like then?
Oh, Toronto was the most incredible place. I remember calling my father and saying, you're not going to believe it. You can't get the New York Times on Sunday except at the Park Plaza. And everybody in Toronto goes to the museum on Sundays wearing white hats. There are banks on every corner. My father said, maybe this means they're solid and good people. It was a very dreary city. A very, very dreary city. Obviously I stayed. Because I liked it here. I liked the university. And I met a lot of people whom I thought were very interesting to talk to. But as an exciting city, I come from the city of Boston, which, talk about blue Boston. I mean, Toronto made Boston look like flaming, It was just extraordinary. But, so I think that to have someone like Marshall into the midst of this, must have seemed very strange.
And presumably that attitude influenced the university.
Yes, I think so. But it was a very good, solid university. My tutor in college had said about this scholarship, I think that's a wonderful place to go. The University of Toronto is very historically based. It's not filled with lousy sociology like Harvard. And she was right. I got a very good MA. And I'm still here, whether it's through inertia or what, I don't know. But it's a city and a country I'm very attached to. But my God, it was dull. It really was dull. It was hard to believe that the drinking laws. I still come from an age when my husband and I used to go into the LCBO, and you had to sign your name. So we used to sign for things like John of Gaunt, Savoy Street, Helen Troy, etc. But no one would believe that this was true. But there was a kind of attractive solidity to the whole business that I kind of liked too. But Marshall was not. Marshall was a strange person in the midst of this. And I think that, but I think he enjoyed it. He really enjoyed it.
And how did he stick out?
Well, he was very tall, for starters. Very tall, very distinctive kind of voice, very casual, didn't give a damn what he said and what tone of voice he said it. And sometimes I think he deliberately, like a naughty child. And one of the things I liked about Marshall was a certain childlike quality. He loved sticking out his tongue towards people whom he knew weren't going to like it. So he said unconventional things about literature. And he was suspect. Had they used the term, they would have said flaky. And hence, this is a little bit dangerous. Are you wasting your time? Are you getting your mind twisted around? And probably, occasionally, I did believe, if not in the cult of the East and the cult of the West, in a whole lot of other things. And I had a wonderful time digging up all this Rosicrucian stuff. But that he was also a very serious reader was something I never had any doubt about at all. And that he was serious in a way that other people weren't. That he also loved what he did. He loved reading. He loved the texts he dealt with.
And did he become better accepted when he became famous?
I'm not sure that even in his famous stage, the university was really sufficiently attentive to Marshall. I'm not sure that his was the kind of attention they wanted the university to have. I think they would have thought it was perhaps a little bit undignified. That you're, hitting the airwaves in and out of Woody Allen films and saying, brief things instead of being logical and ordinary. And I must say that when I try to think of people who would then have been senior colleagues, I can't remember people saying nasty things, but you did have a sense that he was not being taken seriously, as were those who were cranking out, scholarly accounts of God knows what. All of which I think is absolutely, worthwhile too. But there's no reason why you should have both, really. The response to him was not ever that good. I'm not sure. I don't really know any of the politics around the closing of the center. I think what happened is that there was a wave of interest and then it hit the wall and crashed. And that often does happen. It may simply have been also that can that center exist without a person like Marshall in it? I don't know that it can. You need that kind of an exciting force, or it needs to translate itself into a different kind of study. And maybe it was simply doomed in that way.
And did fame change Marshall at all?
No, I don't think he did change, except that I think he may very well have enjoyed the fame, as who would not. It can't have been easy to raise a family of 6 children on a university person's salary, and it must have been absolutely wonderful to have it made easier, I think. I think he was very much internally the same, a man, as I say, of great simplicity and great piety that never stopped. And a man probably, this has just struck me, a man of great privacy. Now that sounds like the last thing in the world for Marshall McLuhan, but I do have a sense of someone whose, internal life was probably something revealed to his confessor. But I did have a sense of someone because I've dealt with other colleagues whose, what went on in their heart was very, very clear. In Marshall's case, you had a sense of a privacy. I've never talked about that, say, to Fred Flahive, but I think that's true. But I think the later years must have been very tough for him, having to go to all those damn interviews and so forth. Part of him would have enjoyed it, but the other part wouldn't have had time to do the kind of work that he really liked to do. And I'm sure a lot of that pressure must have been behind the strokes. Terrible pressure. And as I say, becoming a famous man. Now, he could be outrageous. I remember a friend of mine was dying to meet him. Okay, fine. So I invited Marshall and Corinne to dinner one night. And afterwards, the friend was so perceptive. And I said, he was just talking rot about Canadian art for all the evening. But I said, yeah, but it's always fascinating. I said, you can't always count on Marshall but he'll talk about almost anything. But he was utterly charming that night. He brought us a bottle of Canadian champagne. We thought that was a hoot. And I think he probably thought it was a hoot, too. Yeah, because my son was then 9. He's now 34. And when I was out in the kitchen to get something for dinner, he said, Mummy, is Mr. McLuhan a famous man? And I said, well, maybe he is, but he's really just a friend of ours and one of my favorite teachers. And Peter disappeared upstairs. Because that's really what he was. He didn't like, I think there was a part of him that didn't like being a famous man at all. And I think probably the fame may very well have prevented him from doing something really remarkable in the writing way or in the interpreting way. When he once got sucked into that whole world of talking in sound bites, that was my sense anyway, that I thought he should be, if one had ever been able to sit down and say, Marshall, why don't you go back and take the work on Nash and turn it into something terrific.
Because you didn't agree with the direction that his study had taken?
I felt that this was not the best he could have done. Yeah. Because, as you'll see, I'd really thought very highly of him. And I was very fond of him. I'm not sure how much close contact his students had. In the later days, you'd have to talk to them about that. He was a very sweet person, too. It's an adjective that I would apply very, very sparingly, but he was a very sweet person, kind and gentle. I don't think that comes out of the McLuhan you see blitzing all over the television.
And what did you think when Understanding Media came out?
I thought it was an interesting book that brought up lots of Marshall's things. It seemed to me it could be made use of. I wasn't that excited by it. No. I was much more excited by the thesis when I got around to reading that. Because I thought it was less smart-alecky, less the, how to put it, sort of grabbing the current stuff. It would be terrible to say that I thought Marshall was going over to the sides that he'd always been against before, but there was a bit of that. To say, when I discovered the thesis, I was so excited, and he was rewriting the thesis. Did I tell you that? There's lovely things up and down the first pages being done in the 60s. I remember screaming upstairs to my husband and saying, my God, he was rewriting it. So he was, and I thought that was interesting. He was returning as if what he was trying to do at that point was start to look at that, to reconsider things. But I think a lot of his later career was, at least from my point of view, which is a very, very limited one, was a distraction from what was utterly central in what I thought was an utterly brilliant man.
I've heard it said that the literati reacted badly to Understanding Media because they saw in it the portents of their own doom. Do you think Marshall had any sense of that?
No, I would have thought rather that Marshall was thinking that anybody who was, if their doom was there, they were implicated in it themselves. What Marshall thought of himself of was a kind of diagnostician of what was happening. Hence the strikingness of that business about the Maelstrom. He was trying to figure out why things were going to hell in a handbasket, I guess. No, I didn't feel, it wasn't, the betrayal. But I'm interested that Corinne would feel that, I think, Marshall, the early Marshall, the young man who went to Cambridge, and so fell in love with it that he did have that rowing oar. If you can imagine the excitement that Cambridge must have been to someone, a North American, who emerged and was suddenly working with Leibus. That's the part of Marshall's life that I think is the most extraordinary. Because I don't know whether Corinne still got it, but she used to have a picture of Marshall in his Trinity Hall blazer sitting on a table in the front hall. That was all very important to him. And that's where he was, the very brilliant young man was doing utterly good stuff. I wish that thesis had gotten printed then. A lot of it does come out later on, but and a lot of modern scholarship, certainly in the 18th century, owes an enormous amount to him without the world knowing it.
Some people characterize Marshall as amoral. Do you think that's accurate?
I don't think so. Apolitical, perhaps. But that's, I guess, different from being amoral. It brings me back, I guess for myself, to this sense that Marshall had an inner life that wasn't as accessible to other people externally as, say, the inner lives of those who protest about wars are. that wasn't Marshall's bag. That he was moral in a very special way. He had an extraordinary sense of the students he worked with. I mean, I can only say that for myself. I owed Marshall many debts. He did things for me he didn't need to do, like letters of reference, like long conversations, even this dodge about having me be the babysitter, which was obviously good for me in the sense that it removed me from where I was living into I couldn't call it an ordinary situation, but it was a house full of 6 kids, and that was fun. No, I don't. I think sometimes the charge of being amoral comes from people with a relatively limited sense of what the moral may mean. If Marshall was successful in getting people to think more precisely than they had thought before, it seems to me that's a very important moral task to have done. And he did that without, engaging in any of the fashionable stuff that I did, too. I don't think Marshall would have been interested. I don't think I even asked him to be in the 64 teach-in, because that wasn't what he did. But I can imagine that people would think this, yeah.
I want to go back to the Catholicism for a minute. I know Marshall was very interested in various sects and mystics and so on. What was that all about?
I think he thought that there were forces lined up. On the one side, you might have the Freemasons and their nearest cousins, the Rosicrucians. And they were at war with the Orthodox. I mean, Alexander Pope, but the place where Marshall tended to see this playing out was the Dunciad. Alexander Pope is a Roman Catholic. The 4th book of the Dunciad begins to become a kind of black mass scene, and there are Masonic echoes and issues and so forth in it. And I think Marshall liked to see, the strong antipathy of good to bad and people being lined up against each other. His own Catholicism, I don't think, took any kind of flaming form. I think it was a relatively simple and attractive kind of thing. If you think that the 2 main Catholic intellectuals who would have been central in Marshall's life would have been Etienne Jusson, who founded the Medieval Institute, and Jacques Maritain, it would be perfectly possible, even in the old Protestant city of Toronto, to think that you were existing in the most remarkable intellectual spot if you were in the Medieval Institute. That is, after all, the place where they would be studying the very world that had generated something like the trivium, the quadrivium. You'd be going back to basics, if you like. I think he was probably very aware of that. I wish Sister St. John were still able to talk, because she was a classicist who was very fond of Marshall. I think that probably nobody has quite sorted out his indebtedness to the tradition into which he was, after all, a convert. The people who could have told you about that, as I say, unfortunately, people like Father Shook, Mike Sheehan and so forth, have now all died. But was he an intellectual Catholic? I'm not sure.
And yet he had this great attachment to Thomas Aquinas. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, Thomas, a medieval philosopher, very considerable powers, who never is said to have thought you could prove the existence of God, and had the famous 5 proofs for the existence of God. We don't have to go into those, but Thomas would have thought that you had to believe in God first, and then you found out why it made sense. A man who was trying to construct a worldview. The best commentary I know on Thomas Aquinas is written by Umberto Eco in that lovely book called Travels in Hyperreality. When I first found that, I thought, this is Marshall's kind of book. But Eco's sense of Thomas Aquinas is a kind of sort of a radical thinking out a world and then trying to imagine what he would be like if he existed now. Would he be a Christian? Eco says he doesn't know. So what the Summa is an attempt to be a digest of all things you can think of theologically. I think, again, it's something that you would come to after you were a believer and be glad that all of this works out. I can't see being converted by the Summa at all. And I can't see Marshall McLuhan being converted by the Summa. I think he was a much more interesting man who would suddenly be struck by, yeah, all right, the order of things, there must be a creator. Well, you know, do you have to beat your way through the Summa Theologiae to work on that? I think you might come to it much more through Chesterton. And I think the anecdote's probably right.
Which?
Well, isn't that the one, the business about Chesterton reading what's right with the world or what's wrong with the world? I've now forgotten. No, I don't think it was. I mean, maybe Marshall told Eric that he got it through the Summa. I would be surprised.
Can you talk about his interest in Poe, and particularly in the story The Descent into the Maelstrom?
I think it was what we now fashionably call a foundational text. That the excitement of... He loved Poe anyway. He loved Poe's sense of the finding out of things through careful attention. And Poe came up frequently. Poe's relationship to the French and the rest of it. But I think the story itself... central to his thought. You find out how something works. That's the crucial thing. And then you don't go down with it. I think it was one of his... Remember the term he was tremendously fond of, which is the idea of epiphany. And I think that's why this stuff about working your way through Thomas Aquinas, I think the sudden idea, which is what the epiphany is, when you get some sense of something, that really must have been what motivated Marshall after much investigation circling around the Church of Rome. He also loved, I'm sure this must have been the case, he loved the business of being different. And to be a Roman Catholic in Toronto at that stage would be different. It would be different wherever you were. There's nothing wrong with that. That's why Pope never became anything else. He loved being hugged by people. But I think the sense of epiphany, the sense of analogy, and what he took to be, I think, the Church of Rome at its best, which was its inclusiveness, not of political things, but its inclusiveness of the natural, the human, the humane. That, I think, was important.
He was accused of being sort of sloppy, though, wasn't he, as a scholar?
He was accused of being sloppy in his... certainly his scholarly essays, the ones that got produced in the scholarly journals, were not sloppy. They were very good, and they need almost to be collected again and looked at. No, he was not possibly the best model for scholarship, if you're going to define it in very clear and conventional terms, but you can learn that from other people. You could never walk into Marshall McLuhan's classroom and just sit there. You were part of it. And that was what made it so exciting. And if you didn't remember everything, well, who cares? I mean, whoever looks at these damn notebooks that people fill up with all kinds of things anyway?
We talked about jokes. How about metaphor? How important do you think was metaphor to McLuhan?
It was utterly central to Marshall. It was the way the world worked. Maybe that's where the notion of Catholic doctrines of analogy could come in. Metaphor was the excitement of the world. One thing echoed another, could be made to manifest another, so that everything was intellectually exciting and visually exciting. It wasn't just intellectual. That the world could be a very exciting place because of the centrality of metaphor. So I'm now reviewing a god-awful dull book on, virtue and passion in the novel. And I thought, these are people who've got, certainly, maybe they have virtue, but they certainly don't have any passion. Marshall made you aware of details which were important, and the centrality, as I say, of metaphor, of analogy, and paying attention to that. Where does it go? Chase it down. And the very act of chasing it down was exciting and did something for your mind. That nothing was ever single. Things were always double or triple, or something like that. Like the business of some of my puns trivial and some are quadrivial. And what does this, is it just a funny way of doing, or has a way of phrasing made us think about something in a different way? And so in that way it's important, and that's where the sense of the comedy and the seriousness come together. The pun can be very funny, but it also can be very instructive at the same time. And the way we learn is that kind of sense of instructiveness. Someone was just saying to me last night at dinner about a former teaching assistant of mine. She said, God, when he was in class, it was wonderful. And that poor guy who came after him, for whom everything was dead. Things are dead when you don't see the implications of others. But this can be dismissed as frivolity, too. But there's nothing wrong with frivolity if it's a way to something else.
Do you think he was an optimist or a pessimist?
Oh, he was an optimist, I think, despite all the gloom that goes out professionally. Marshall always looked to me like one of the most cheerful people God ever invented, partly because he was, and that's when the Catholicism is important. He was very centered in terms of a religious point of view, and that made him optimistic, so he could go ahead and be blitzing away and be a pessimist. And pessimists like that are always really optimists because they think they can do something about it. No, internally an optimist, certainly, yeah. And a kind of, I used to like to see Marshall watching across the St. Mike's campus because he always did look. He looked happy to me. And, ha ha ha, I would say, ha ha. Wow. He remained a really sweet man. I remember his calling up at one stage wanting to go to lunch with Eric because he was wanting me to give advice on what Eric could do. Because somebody came along later on and again said, was that Marshall McLuhan sitting outside your door? And I felt impatient because I said, well, a friend of mine had come and was sitting outside my door. But I thought it must be hard to be the almighty totem pole. I think when you get pulled down in the maelstrom, I've always been amazed that Poe's sailor had enough time to think out how he could think out the maelstrom, because I would just have gone gurgling down, I suspect. And I think to a certain degree, maybe that's what happened to Marshall later on. Drawn tremendously into all this, becoming a folk hero after Fordham, doing all of these things. But the funeral was great. It really was. Because he wanted Amazing Grace played on the bagpipes on the way out, and it was just terrific. It was just wonderful. And I thought, this is lovely, this Scottish touch, this man who grew up as a Presbyterian, Amazing Grace on the bagpipes in a Catholic church. That has got to be one of the most wonderful paradoxes I can think of. It was a great funeral. Patrick Watson spoke at it, and so did a variety of other people. But it was just terrific. I remember sitting downstairs at the funeral home with Sheila Watson and Fred Flahive. We couldn't get over the fact that, they always have the name above the door and said Marshall McLuhan. And I said, Sheila, what do you think Marshall? She said Marshall would have howled with laughter at all of this. I said, you mean wait until McLuhan wakes or something like this. But the idea of having this in a funeral home and this above it was something we couldn't get over.
Why?
Well, it just seemed so crazy that the idea that Marshall should be. Then, of course, we had an extraordinary adventure when we drove out to the graveyard because Sheila and David Staines and Fred and I got lost. So we arrived at the funeral place just as, everybody else was leaving. And, of course, since it was winter, they couldn't put the coffin in the ground. And Sheila kept saying, we can't just leave Marshall there. And I said, we've got to, because they weren't going to bury him until the spring. And then we began to think of how Marshall would have enjoyed our discomfiture as we were leaving him in the landscape. Not a bad way to go.